everyone. I'm so pleased to welcome you back for another episode of Curious People Wanted, our video series by the Barnum Museum. My name is Adrienne Saint-Pierre, and I've been working with the collection here in Bridgeport, Connecticut since 2010. And I'm always learning new things about the items in our collection. And it's especially rewarding to see the collection grow with the addition of new pieces. Of course, when I say new, I really mean new to us. Just a few months ago, we received a miniature dress shirt dating to the 1800s. And it's made exactly like a typical shirt of that time, but as you see, it is much, much smaller. Now, this gift came with the information that it had belonged to General Tom Thumb. But trying to square that family lore with physical evidence has presented us with a bit of a mystery. I thought I'd share that with you, as well as show you some other early shirts in our collection, including a handsome one that belonged to P.T. Barnum and several that we know belonged to General Tom Thumb. So we'll call this episode a shirt show, featuring men's shirts in tiny, small, and large sizes. First, let's zoom in on our new shirt, the tiny one, to see how it was made, and then I'll tell you the background we were given, and we'll compare it with the others. This shirt is a mere 12 inches, roughly, from top to bottom, really small. It's made of a fine linen shirting material. And the stitching includes both machine and hand stitching. Most of this is machine sewn. So most likely this dates to the 1860s or later, since sewing machines did not become really common until then. And it was meant to be worn with a separate detachable collar. See, there's just a neckband here. That's a fashion that came about in the 1850s, but it wasn't universal until the later decades of the 1800s and then continued into roughly the 1930s. This is a really well-made shirt. Every detail is, as it should be, the same as it would be on a regular size shirt. So let me point out some of the details, since shirts from the 1800s are quite a bit different from today's men's shirts. For instance, it features a pleated shirt bosom here. That's the important area that would show, of course, along with a collar when it was worn with a jacket. So you want that part to look really nice, and that means it would often get some extra starch. A pleated shirt front was a common feature. It was not limited to formal wear like today. Now here in the center of this shirt, you see there are a couple of small holes. These are not holes left by buttons that were torn off. These are little stitched eyelets made specifically for using metal studs, probably gold studs. Shirt studs are a form of men's jewelry and not only looked classier than buttons, they were temporary and could be taken out when the shirt was to be washed. In fact, using shirt studs could also provide the flexibility for instance, adding a fine linen ruffle that would be attached on top of this shirt bosom, an option for fancy wear. Now, the cuffs also have two holes each, so that these would have been meant for cufflinks. And we actually have a single cufflink here that belonged to Tom Thumb. It's a tiny engraved oval with sort of a scalloped edge, and you can see how small it is against that penny there. Of course, men's shirt sizes today go by the collar size and the sleeve length. So let's look at this neckband. This I have measured, it is only 8.5 inches in circumference. And as I mentioned, a separately made collar would be attached to the neckband with again, a stud, not a button. The idea was that the collar could be changed daily or even morning and evening if need be. This allowed a man to present a fresh appearance without the expense of washing the whole shirt as frequently. It also meant that that separate collar could be heavily starched, more so than the shirt. No collar came with this shirt, unfortunately. Now, let's turn this around here so you can see the back. The opening to this shirt is not in the front, it's in the back. And there's a placket here, much like you would see on a shirt sleeve above the cuff. At the top is the one place where there would be a regular button. It's missing now, just the threads are left. Buttons were always subject to damage or loss in the process of laundering. When you think about a garment being put through a mangle to wring out the excess water, it's no wonder. All right, let's turn this around again. Now, are you wondering about this little tab here? I believe this was used to button the shirt front onto the trouser waistband to keep the shirt in place, so it would not ride up and look crumpled. The trouser waist would really be somewhat higher up on the torso compared to the way trousers are worn today, with belts to secure them. Now, the best part, and also part of our mystery, is this letter M right here on the button tab. It's embroidered in red in the tiniest little cross stitches. The whole letter is just 3/16 of an inch high, and there are 5 cross stitches in that 3/16 inch. In the past, it was common practice to mark owners' initials on items that were to be laundered. This was in order to keep track of them. Textiles were considerably more valuable in the past, and even ordinary cottons and linens. So marking letters, and sometimes numbers as well, would be put on bed sheets, towels, women's undergarments, infant shirts, men's shirts, gowns, and so on, anything that was laundered. Historically, these initials were always embroidered, and that's the reason girls were taught to do cross-stitch samplers. But in the 19th century, people began to use pen and ink as a time saver. I've seen the ink method probably more often on things like bed linens and towels, not so much garments like shirts. But the thing that's unusual about the marking on this shirt is that there is just a single letter, not 2 or 3. And so that leads to our mystery question: who did this little shirt really belong to? The donor's information is that an ancestor named Catherine Jones Dunn owned a boarding house in Cleveland, Ohio. It was located at Superior Avenue and 6th Street. This was in the late 1800s, though they didn't know the exact dates. And I did find at least one photograph from that period showing the location. I don't know if it was exactly the corner where the boarding house was, but it shows that the homes in that area were really quite elegant, not seedy looking. So this was certainly a high-class establishment. Well, the family lore is that Tom Thumb stayed at Mrs. Dunn's boarding house, and that is how she came into possession of the shirt. Whether the shirt was left behind or given as a kind of souvenir was not passed down in the story. But the story unravels when you look at the physical evidence. The initial M on the shirt obviously does not figure into the stage name General Tom Thumb, nor Tom Thumb's real name, which was Charles Stratton. Also, the size of this shirt is really very small, and certainly way smaller than Charles Stratton was as an adult. So you might think, well, could he have worn this when he was a child? I'd say no, because the style of this shirt dates it to the latter half of the 1800s, and Charles was an adult then. He was born in 1838. We actually have several shirts worn by him that are in our collection, and I brought a couple out here for you to see. There are several similar ones that have embroidered bands on the shirt bosom, more decorative than the simple pleats. And all of our shirts show a combination of machine and hand sewing, but they kind of vary in some having more hand sewing than machine and the other way around. This particular one is almost entirely hand sewn. But when you look at the tiny stitches, they would really fool you into thinking that it was done by a machine. They are just so small and perfect. The clue really is in looking at the underside, because you can see what's called a backstitch technique. It looks different than the underside of machine sewing. This is an incredible sewing project, to say the least. I'm afraid these stitches are so tiny you can't really see them on camera, but I did count, and there are about 22 stitches per inch. That is a lot. It just astounds me. And then there's this beautiful embroidery down the front here. I think this shirt is probably the earliest one of Tom Thumb's that we have, and it is a shame that it's in such fragile condition. Really, really kind of in rough shape, both from starch and just age. Garments like shirts and undergarments really took the abuses of laundering, starching, and frequent wear, and the fibers degrade and turn kind of yellow. And then, if things are put away, stored in like a wooden drawer or cardboard box, the fabric can even turn brown from the acidity in wood and paper that it's up against. Luckily, our new little shirt has remained in good shape over the years. So let's just compare our new shirt with these ones. No question that it is much smaller. These two shirts here that belonged to Charles are more in the range of 18 inches long or longer compared to the 12 inches of our new one. And these shirts have collars that are attached, the old-fashioned style, rather than having the neckband with the detachable collar. So that's another clue that these shirts are older than our 12-inch shirt. Even among our collection of Charles's shirts, we see variations in size. And that's because Charles grew taller over time. It's possible the variations in length might just be due to preference at different times. But so often people ask us, how tall was Tom Thumb? And the answer is that it depends upon what age you're asking about. When Charles was 25 in 1863, he was 36 inches tall. We have a photograph of him around that time. So he had grown about 15 inches in the 20 years since P.T. Barnum first met him as a young child. When Charles died in 1883, just 20 years after his marriage to Lavinia Warren, he was 42 inches tall. So he grew another 6 inches in that second 20-year time frame. Well, putting on my thinking cap and trying to make sense of the initial M and the smaller than Charles size, I thought, well, maybe this shirt belonged to the second husband of Charles's wife, his widow, Lavinia Warren. Like Charles, she was a little person, and her second marriage was to another little person named Count Primo Magri. He had come to this country from Italy along with his brother in 1878. Lavinia married Count Magri in 1883, and they traveled around the country and performed on stage. He was 8 years younger than Lavinia, and at the time of their marriage, he was said to be 32 inches tall. So he was actually closer in height to Lavinia than Charles had been. Baron Magri, that's his brother, was about the same size, and he too was part of their troupe. Well, during this time, Lavinia continued to use the stage name Mrs. General Tom Thumb. That was her professional name. So that made me think, oh yes, it must be that Catherine Dunn had confused Count Magre with Tom Thumb because Lavinia was still known as Mrs. General Tom Thumb. That would explain the initial M on the shirt. Plus, I also found that the Magres were touring in Ohio in January of 1887, and that really would fit the time frame nicely. So all this seems like a plausible explanation, right? But I don't think it's the answer. We have a number of photographs of the Count and his brothers, so we can see their sizes. And we also have a few items the Count wore, like this shirt bosom. This is, I guess, what you would today call a dickie. You can see this is quite large. It probably went all the way down to the waist. So it is clear that Count Magri was nowhere near small enough to have worn this little shirt. Nor was he in this country when he was very young. He was 29 years old when he came to America. So this all shreds the theory that this shirt belonged to Count Magri and that Catherine Dunn had mistakenly thought he was General Tom Thumb. If you have any ideas, do let us know. There were certainly little people who were much smaller than Charles and Lavinia and the Magris. And in the 1800s, many did find employment as performers. I really think this is too fine to have been like a doll's shirt. So I don't think that quite answers our problem. And plus, why would there be an initial on a doll's shirt? So there's our mystery. But now let's turn to Mr. Barnum's large shirt, at least large in comparison to the others. And I'll bring a photograph over here of Mr. Barnum. Here we have a photograph of P.T. Barnum. It was taken in the 1880s. Now, Barnum was about 5 feet 10 inches tall. That's according to his passport application from the 1840s. So he was not unusually tall. But now, compared to the 8.5-inch neckband on our tiny shirt, Barnum's shirt neckband is 17 inches as measured around the outside. This shirt dates to about 1880, and a few years ago we had this conserved by the Textile Conservation Workshop in South Salem, New York. And before that it looked very yellowed, kind of like these little shirts do. So that just shows what really good conservation work can do without harming the garment. No bleaching or anything harsh like that was done. Well, first thing people say when they see an old-fashioned man's shirt is, oh, that's a nightshirt. That's because they look so much longer than today's men's shirts. So yes, a man could wear a regular shirt as a nightshirt if that's all he had. Shirts were cut very full and loose, but a true nightshirt would actually be much longer, covering most of the legs. The goal, of course, was to stay as warm as possible. So why was a regular shirt so long? Well, it had the dual purpose of serving as underwear too. Men's underwear, as we know it, was not common until the 1930s. The details of Mr. Barnum's shirt are very much like our tiny new shirt, although his also has a ruffle, which has been actually stitched on top of the shirt bosom. And it too has a pleat similar to this one. Now, I've pinned this ruffle a little bit to the side here. It's not hanging quite straight as it would, so that you can see his initials embroidered in red here, PTB. They would have been hidden, of course, when the shirt was worn. So that's, again, they're tiny, tiny little cross stitches. The quality of linen and the expertise of the shirt maker were a sign of a man's wealth and social standing. And as I mentioned, garments cost a whole lot more in the past than they generally do today. So people kept garments, repairing them when necessary, not discarding them. After a season or a year, they tended to hang on to them. Interestingly, when Barnum was in Europe in the 1840s, he was in his mid-30s at that time, he apparently lost several of his fine new shirts at the boarding house where he was staying in Paris. We know this because in a letter that he wrote to Tom Thumb's father, he said, "You know, I had 12 linen shirts made in Brussels. 6 of them are gone. Please tell Mrs. Lawson that they must have been taken from the drawer in my bureau, as I generally left my door open. And that I want her to keep her eye open, and perhaps she may find out the thief. Now, they were all linen with ruffles, collars and wristbands stitched inside for turning over, the cuffs turning back on themselves, and a loop and a buttonhole at the breast. So that's a nice description of Mr. Barnum's shirts. Unfortunately, we don't know if he ever recovered the ones that were stolen or if the thief was ever caught. I hope you've enjoyed today's shirt show, and if you do have any plausible ideas to help us solve our tiny shirt mystery, please let us know. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you will be alerted to new videos as well as episodes in our podcast series, Becoming Barnum, The Journey to Fame and Fortune. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time for another episode of Curious People Wanted. Stay curious.